I'm Jim Cutler, and this is US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by visiting US Modernist's massive mid-century modern archives at usmodernist.org. Or if you're hoarding old architecture magazines, and who isn't, you can donate to our online library and make them accessible to everyone. Today, US Modernist Radio welcomes Sarasota architectural historian Lorrie Muldowney and, via Skype from France, real estate journalist Harold Bubil. And now, your host, the accidental archivist, George Smart.
Hi, folks. Support for US Modernist Radio comes from Realtor Angela Roll. Episode 4, A New Hope. It is a time of discomfort and unrest. Bulldozers from the evil galactic empire have torn down millions of modernist houses across the galaxy. Rebel spies have stolen plans for the empire's ultimate weapon, the Giga Mansion, a house so large it can wipe out entire planets. Pursued by the Imperial fleet, Princess Angela Roll races home aboard her converted DeLorean, custodian of stolen Giga Mansion plans. If it can be destroyed, Princess Angela will save modernism and restore good architecture to the galaxy. What will happen? Tune in next time for episode 5. Meanwhile, back on Earth, modernist realtor Angela Roll uses the force of her real estate and architectural training to specialize in modernist houses, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to the correct use of a lightsaber. Angela Roll is your special agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550. There's some big news today. Actually, as we're recording this, which will come out later in the fall, we just found out that one of the most iconic houses in the country is for sale. Have you heard about this?
What?
No.
Yes, the Brady Bunch house in Los Angeles. With that wonderful staircase coming down where all the kids were lined up. Supposedly the second most photographed house in the country. You can pick up, I think, for $1.8 million now. Wow. If you're a fan of the Brady Bunch.
Does that come with the football that broke Marcia's nose?
Oh, yes, of course. I hope so. For $1.8 million, you'd think I'd get the football.
Exactly. And I'm sure you'll have the provenance for it, all the documentation that shows this is the actual ball.
Right.
They probably cleaned the blood off of it by now.
I would hope so.
Yeah, let's hope that happens. So let's get some guests on. With training in historic preservation, architecture, and urban planning, Lorrie Muldowney is president of Creative Preservation and has lived in Sarasota County, Florida, for the past 47 years. She formerly served as County Historical Resources Specialist and manager of the Sarasota County History Center. She is part of the wildly popular architectural trolley tours offered by the Center for Architecture Sarasota, along with our next guest, Harold Bubil, the former Sarasota Herald-Tribune real estate editor. He has written about modernist architecture since way before it became cool. And now retired from the paper after 43 years, he continues to write feature stories and is working on a book, Florida Buildings I Love. Welcome, Lorrie. Welcome, Harold.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So, Lorrie, you've lived in Sarasota 47 years. Does that still make you a newcomer?
Thankfully not. Sarasota is much more accepting of new folks coming to town, and I think more open to their ideas and thoughts than perhaps we were 30 or 40 years ago.
So what does it take now, about 10 years to become a regular?
I'd say so.
About 10.
About 10.
Yeah.
We call them semi-natives.
Yeah.
And in my book, Lorrie is a newcomer because she came in 1970, 69 or 70?
70,
70, and I arrived in 1958. when Paul Rudolph was still building the Sarasota High School.
Yeah.
So I grew up with this stuff, and of course Lorrie came with credentials, and I didn't. So I kind of stand in her shadow most of the time because of her impeccable credentials.
Well, that should buy you a few extra years, Lorrie, with the credentials. It's like
that's right.
earning advanced placement in high school.
Right.
Lorrie, when I first heard of Sarasota growing up, it was in the connection with the circus. I knew that Ringling Brothers made its winter home there. I always had this picture as a 9-year-old of like elephants walking around the streets and giraffes and trapeze artists having beers together. But in the 40s, a new claim to fame started with young architects starting designing interesting beach houses. Tell us about that.
Well, Sarasota is known today for the circus, for our Mennonite community, and for its architecture. That's the latest from our Visit Sarasota organization. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Just before World War II, Paul Rudolph was here in Sarasota prior to completing his education in architecture, and he was working with Ralph Twitchell, and they were doing some very innovative designs for mainly small beach houses on the barrier islands. He returned to Sarasota after World War II, and that's when he had his practice here for a number of years, and most of the buildings we think of were done.
Who were some of the other architects that came along with Rudolph during that time?
So following Rudolph, there were probably about half a dozen. One of the more prominent and known more broadly would be Victor Lundy, who was here for, I'd say, about 8 or 10 years.
He's still alive, right?
He is.
Yep.
He was here. In fact, he came to Sarasota during Sarasota Mod weekend 2 years ago. And yes, he's still dividing his time between fine art and architectural design was the last I understood, and he's in Texas. We have a couple of other architects. When I was thinking this morning about some of the architects associated with the movement that have had the greatest impact on Sarasota, I wanted to mention Jack West, who was here practicing for 60 years. He died about 7 or 8 years ago. And then, of course, Tim Siebert. Modernism weekend last year celebrated the work of Siebert. And there again, he practiced here for 60 years or more. And so both of those architects, West and Siebert, had their imprint on Sarasota in a way that neither Rudolph or Lundy did because they simply didn't stay as long.
Don't you just love those sound bites, George?
I do.
Just absolute perfection there.
They just come spilling out.
You'd think she was reading it out of a book.
So, Harold, you're in France. Are you on vacation or are you milling about looking at architecture?
Well, my wife thinks we're on vacation. I mean, we're just kind of staying over here for a while, so it's kind of a working vacation. I'm not looking at that much architecture, although when I was driving through Paris a week ago on the Périphérique Intérieur, I stumbled upon the Philharmonie de Paris, new Paris Philharmonic Hall by Jean Nouvel. And I almost drove our little Fiat 500 off the Périphérique and down into one of the neighborhoods because the building is so awesome. Everybody should look it up, the Paris Philharmonic Hall by Jean Nouvel. It's really amazing. Paris has a lot of great architecture, and, Brittany has some good architecture. Yeah, I would say most of that, which is being built now, is modernist. They don't really build retro architecture in Europe. If they're building for today, they're building for today. They're not building revivalist things. So even a simple highway overpass will be, you talk about, we don't allow your architecture here. Well, they insist on architecture in France and pretty much throughout Europe.
Harold, I have a question for you. Tell us about the Sarasota School of Architecture. Now, when I first heard that phrase, I thought there was like a building somewhere I could go sign up for classes. I could join the fighting draftsmen, the athletic team. I could buy T-shirts, but it's not a real place. Tell us what it is.
Well, yeah, they would be saying, "Go Graphite, go."
Yeah, right.
the thing about the Sarasota school is if it were a real school and they had a football team, they wouldn't be a very good football team, but they would have a beautiful stadium.
Ah, excellent.
So if only they did that, and I guess they've designed many stadiums themselves. But the Sarasota School of Architecture is a school of thought, like the Prairie School or the Ashcan School. It started really with the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright at Florida Southern College in Lakeland in the 30s. A decade before that, a young architect named Ralph Twitchell was sent here by Dwight James Baum from New York to oversee the construction of Ca-Dizan, the mansion for John and Mabel Ringling. And that was completed in 1925. Just 2 years later, Ringling brought the circus here to move its winter headquarters to Sarasota, and that is where Sarasota became known as the Circus City. They stayed until 1960. So when Twitchell was overseeing construction of Ca-Dizan, after that was completed, he decided to stay in Sarasota. He got that sand in his shoes, and he started designing some Mediterranean revival houses in a place called Whitfield Estates. And then the real estate boom went crash, and he went back north for a few years. But eventually in the 30s, he returned to Sarasota and established a practice. And Lorrie, feel free to jump in if I get any of my facts wrong. And right about 1937-38, after Frank Lloyd Wright had designed Falling Water in Pennsylvania, he got a call from Lud Spivey, president of Florida Southern College, and said, we don't have a lot of money, but we have a blank slate, and you can come down here and design a whole campus. So Frank Lloyd Wright did that. He came in, I'd say, designed about 12 or 14 buildings. I think 8 of them might have been built. 8 of the structures might have been built during Frank Lloyd Wright's lifetime. But all the architects in Florida were keenly aware of Frank Lloyd Wright doing important work at Florida Southern College.
So he really did do a school.
He did a master plan for the school. Two of the structures are not classroom buildings. One of them is a covered walkway system called the Esplanades, and the other one is a water fountain, a huge water fountain called the Water Dome. And then a number, like a library, 2 chapels, the Danforth Chapel, the Pfeiffer Chapel, the Hollis, like a library room, like a round conference room area, and some other classroom buildings. But then other architects came along after that and completed the campus. And now, recently, Robert A.M. Stern has done some exciting buildings on the campus as well. So that was a big influence on Ralph Twitchell. And he brought those modernist ideas back to Sarasota around 1940, at the same time that he was helping to design the Lido Casino, which was an Art Deco style bathing pavilion and pool complex on Lido Beach. Also at about that time, Twitchell had the wisdom to hire a young graduate from Alabama Auburn University, and his name was Paul Rudolph. And he came and worked with Twitchell for about 6 months. Went off to the war, worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, learned about new materials, and then after the war, he rejoined Twitchell after studying under Walter Gropius at Harvard at the Graduate School of Design, and really got his academic chops in order, and then returned to Sarasota and was partnered with Twitchell from about 1947 or 48 until about 1952. So to get back to the original question, because of this lucky thing of having Frank Lloyd Wright influencing Ralph Twitchell and hiring Paul Rudolph, Sarasota started to get a little bit of a blip on the architectural radar, and young architects started coming here and working for the Twitchell-Rudolph partnership. Lorrie mentioned a couple of them. Jack West was one of them, and I think Bert Grossmith and a number of guys. Tim Siebert worked a little bit with them. And eventually we started to get critical mass, kind of like the mothership, creating a gravitational field and drawing young architects to it. Lundy came in the early 50s. Lundy and Rudolph were classmates under Gropius. I wouldn't say they got along all that great in Sarasota, but they did great work, and each in their own language. Lundy's work was very curvaceous. Rudolph was really wedded to the international style early on before he started to become a little bit more expressive modern, and then eventually brutalist before he became Dean of Architecture at Yale in the late 50s. So, really from about 1948 to 1960, Sarasota had its white-hot period of mid-century modernism. It was believed that around 1966 or so, the public kind of grew tired of modernism and it kind of fell out of favor. But in the last 20 years or so, I think it's come back into favor.
Lorrie, let me ask you, as these architects moved into the area and built these houses and the period of time between the 50s and early 60s, did Sarasota warm to this design, or did they just kind of tolerate these architects and their wealthy clients putting up these weird-looking houses?
I would definitely say that the designs were embraced with great enthusiasm. There were a number of small houses that were built out on the barrier islands, oftentimes by people who lived here just seasonally, and I've always sort of thought that for that reason, the clients were more willing to experiment with different materials and different building forms. And because, of course, that physical environment is so different than what they might have experienced in their lifetimes up in the north. So there was a lot of attention paid both locally and nationally. And then what I focused my research on when I was in school was the schools that were built here as part of the Sarasota School of Architecture movement. There were about 9 schools or additions to existing schools that were done here from basically the early to mid-1950s to the early 1960s. The last one was Paul Rudolph's addition to the Sarasota High School. The first one was Brookside Middle School, which no longer exists. However, it was met with great critical acclaim when it was opened. If you can imagine, it was completed on budget and completed a little bit early. So that was quite a success story for the Board of Public Instruction. At that time, Philip Hiss was the chairman of the Board of Public Instruction. That might be a name that's familiar to some of your listeners. Hiss was the developer for Lido Shores, and he also had
Alger's cousin, wasn't he?
His nephew.
Nephew of Alger Hiss?
Yes, yes. So Hiss was the developer for Lido Shores. And, as many of your listeners know, Lido Shores is where we have the iconic umbrella house as well as the
Hiss studio.
The Hiss studio, right, and quite a number of significant structures. And most of the modernism weekend, many of the modernism walking tours are focused on Lido Shores because it is such a compact neighborhood with so many resources from the Sarasota School of Architecture movement.
And the residents are very good about driving around crowds of
yes.
No problem there.
Yes, yes. And I'd say it's still a location for great architecture. Wonderful things are being built. Even today, there's a lot of focus on that Lido Shores neighborhood.
In time, it's the end of the 60s, early 70s. Modernism has fallen out of favor. Paul Rudolph is long gone. We head into kind of a period where nobody cares about modernism, right?
Well,
I would agree.
You would say that maybe the mass public did, but a lot of the architects continued to work in Sarasota. Frank Folsom Smith, Tim Siebert among them.
Right.
And Tim Siebert designed a lot of buildings for Arvida Corporation as it developed along Boat Key. And those buildings, even though they're 40 years old now or older, still have a beauty to them as well. And a more sophisticated modernist language than what you saw in the 50s. So, there was a lot of experimentation going on. And as we learned which materials worked and which didn't on the barrier islands in a salty environment, and the building codes got tougher after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, and the passage of the National Flood Insurance Program in the late 60s, it had a huge effect on our architecture because we saw the materials change, the beefiness of the buildings became heavier, and they had to be elevated as well, depending on which flood zone they were in. So those regulatory things had a profound effect on how the architecture appeared. No more delicate stuff anymore. So
Yeah, I know that the commercial buildings were continuing to go up and there were other things as well, but it seemed like the public interest in modernism was really on the decline. And I'm wondering, like, at what point did it kind of pop up again? What led to, in the 90s, people paying attention to this legacy of modernist houses again, for instance?
You want to take that one, Lorrie?
I think I'll let you take that one.
Okay, well, I can precisely identify. A book was written by an architect from Tampa named John Howie, and he wrote a book called The Sarasota School of Architecture, 1941 to 1966, and it was published in 1995. I think the Princeton Press did it, and it's still available. It's kind of like the Bible. I mean, if you're going to read about Sarasota School of Architecture, you have to start with that book. I like to say that John wrote the book on the Sarasota School, and it really kind of details the history of it and explains it. Now, there have been other books written since then, like Sarasota Modern by Andrew Weaving, Paul Rudolph, The Florida Houses by Chris Dolman and Joe King, and some other books, maybe one by me someday, buildings I love, if I can get around to it. When you're writing it one chapter, 1 week at a time, it takes a little bit of time. But anyway, that book in 1995 really kind of put it back on the map.
Yes.
And in 2001, a Lido Shores resident named Marty Lieberman was...
Oh, yeah. I know Marty.
Yeah, exactly. She was a member of the Fine Arts Society of Sarasota at that time. And she lived in Lido Shores. And a neighbor lady said to her, "Do you know where you live? Do you know what the significance of this neighborhood is?" And she proceeded to explain to Marty the legacy of the Sarasota School. So Marty started organizing an event that was held in November 2001 called the American Legacy Tour and Symposia. And that brought people from, architecture people from all over the country. George, you would have jetted down on your motorcycle to get here for this event, because it really kind of put Sarasota modernism back on the map.
Yes, we have a special motorcycle jet all fueled up, ready for these trips.
Exactly. Yeah. But it kind of brought a new attention. And about that time, I started writing about architecture in all of the local media magazines, and people started catching on to it. The older houses now those that were surviving became kind of like worth remodeling now. Not remodeling, but renovating or adding to. The challenge was, if you wanted to add to them, a lot of them were in a flood zone, a B or an A zone on the Barrier Islands, so you had to be mindful of the 50% rule and the flood insurance FEMA regulations. So, but a lot of people thought, "Oh, I've got this." His studio was added to in 1962, but it's been meticulously maintained. The umbrella house was redone at least, I think it's on its third redo now. Most recently, the current owners rebuilt the umbrella structure.
Right.
So these things have become kind of collector's items. And some of the residents of Lido Shores own these houses as guests. They use them as guest houses. Like, they'll be across the street from where they live, from the newer house that they live, and they'll use the mid-century gems as guest houses. And a number of other buildings. The Paul Rudolph Sarasota High School has been restored on the outside and replaced on the inside. Riverview High School was torn down, but the Victor Lundy's Chamber of Commerce building has been well maintained, and a lot of the buildings are being seen for what they are, and they have quite a bit of impetus to save them. And the new wealthy people who are coming to town and building what we call west of the trail, so over towards saltwater, they tend to build as often in modern language now as they do Mediterranean revival, and that has really changed in the last 20 years. I'd say it's about 50-50 now, as opposed to 1 in 20 back in the year 2000.
Right.
Well, Lorrie, let's go back to 2001. So with Marty Lieberman's work with these American Legacy conferences, did that turn into the SAF, the Sarasota Architecture Foundation?
It did, yes. The Fine Arts Society was the organization that was behind the symposium, but as I understand things, shortly after the symposium, they kind of recognized that architecture was not central to their mission, and so there was a spin-off organization that was formed by Marty and a local attorney who still operates in town, Tom Luzier, and they were the co-founders of the Sarasota Architectural Foundation, which continues to do great work in Sarasota today.
Marty, wasn't it the case that they actually made enough money on the American Legacy event that they had this kind of windfall from it, and they decided to invest in the SAF? Is that right?
That makes sense to me. Certainly the symposium was very, very successful. They had been planning it for years, and there were thousands of people that came to town for it.
And this was right after 9/11, too.
Yes, just weeks after 9/11, in fact. Yeah. I wanted to add as well that from my standpoint, having worked in government for so many years, some important things that have happened following the symposium and in really due to the symposium was that the county did a survey of buildings from the Sarasota School of Architecture and began to build a database so that information could be shared with members of the public, and also to some extent when permits were pulled for those buildings, there was some oversight by county staff in regards to the treatments planned for the buildings. Also, over time, we've had more and more structures associated with the Sarasota School of Architecture historically designated. One of the earliest was in the city of Sarasota, and that was the Cocoon House, which perhaps some of your listeners recognize.
No, not from the movie.
Oh.
The Hilly Guest House. What's the year on that, Harold? Do you know offhand? I'm putting you on the spot. I'm sorry.
I believe that was 1950.
Okay.
It might have been 52, but I believe it was 1950.
Okay. On the north end
called it Cocoon House because the roof was insulated with a material called cocoon that was used to mothball ships after World War II. So right. Paul Rudolph learned about this material while he was working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard during the war and thought it might make a good roofing material. He tried it. It didn't work. It deteriorated and fell apart not soon after it was installed. So they had to eventually install a standard roofing, modified bit roof on there. But it still has the shape, which is a catenary curve, kind of like curved downwards.
Well, let's get back to the SAF. So they're doing some pretty exciting things lately, and they have some houses that are under their auspices that people can tour. Tell us about that, Lorrie.
So SAF is regularly opening the Umbrella House on Lido Shores to the public for tours. They're doing that, I believe, certainly once a month, perhaps more frequently than that. They've also recently leased this same house that we were just talking about, the Cocoon House, which is on the north end of Siesta Key. And they are opening that periodically for tours to the public as well. And that has been a house that has not been accessible to the public at all in the years that I can remember. So that's just a wonderful way to bring attention to the movement. Also, very interestingly, about 2 years ago now, Sarasota Architectural Foundation funded the reconstruction of the Walker Guest House, which is a building that exists on Sanibel Island and was done by Paul Rudolph. It's in a somewhat inaccessible location, and it's a somewhat fragile building. So SAF decided to have it reconstructed and placed on the grounds of the Ringling Museum of Art. And it was open to the public there for almost 2 years. And that recently has been closed up, but it was sort of an introduction to inviting people into historic homes and letting them experience that firsthand.
So what happened to the house?
I have some new news. Well, we have some new news as of like 2 hours ago.
Okay, breaking news.
Breaking news on the Walker Guest House. Now, it's a replica. So they built
replica, I'm sorry, that's the correct word.
Built it without a bathroom. They replaced the bathroom with a lift for wheelchairs that would lift people off the ground like 2 feet to get into the house. So it's not technically a residence. It's more of an educational museum piece. So that's how they were able to erect it on the grounds of the Ringling Art Museum grounds without having to meet building codes. But it was made to be assembled and disassembled and stored and shipped to another location. And it has just been announced that it's going to Palm Springs for a 17-month stay. And that was, I just got that email 2 hours ago. So I'll be putting it on this week.
When will it go?
I don't have that detail yet, but it'll be very soon.
Well, Tom and I are going to be out in Palm Springs in February. We'll have to look for it.
You'll probably see it. And you can see, I did a story on it when it opened, and there are a lot of photos online at heraldtribune.com.
So, George, can we stay there?
No, we can't stay there, but we can walk through it.
Okay.
You can for a while.
You can have a cocktail there.
Yes.
There you go.
Lorrie, about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5, a new group emerged in town, the Center for Architecture Sarasota, which did some of the same kind of things as SAF, but also different. Tell us about that group.
Right. Well, Center for Architecture Sarasota, as you said, was established 4 or 5 years ago, and really central to their purpose, or certainly their startup activities, was the restoration of a very significant building in our downtown core, which is called the Scott Commercial Building. It was built to be a furniture showroom, and the architects for this commercial building were Bill Rupp and William Farrell. It is still owned by Sarasota County. It had functioned as a print shop for a number of years, and prior to that as an archive for a local music organization. The building hadn't really been altered over time, but it had never been restored either, so it was in need of some tender, loving care. The Center for Architecture Sarasota was able to gain a long-term lease for the building from Sarasota County government, did private fundraising, and with the cooperation of architect Guy Peterson, they were able to do a wonderful renovation of the space. It serves now as an architectural gallery. It's a location where there are changing exhibits, where now there are architectural trolley tours, as you mentioned earlier, and there's classroom space for public lectures. So it's been a great addition to our local architectural community. Center for Architecture Sarasota is really mostly focused on education, and they do a great job of it.
I was very honored to speak in that building earlier this spring and got to go on these trolley tours, which are headed up by our 2 guests, Lorrie and Harold. Each take a trolley full of excited architecture fans and start rolling them around town. So, Harold, tell us about the experience of being on the architecture trolley.
Well, when you put a live microphone in my hands, it can become a dangerous thing. I love doing trolley tours and public speaking. I probably like that better than anything else I do. So it's very exciting to me to kind of rattle off these facts while we're rolling, and I'm trying to keep my balance. I'm holding onto a pole inside the trolley bus, and we are speaking over the sound of the engine, and it's just a real dynamic, energetic atmosphere. And, the people are on that bus because they want to be there. I love teaching older audiences because they want to be there. They're not made to be there as young people are made to be in school. So they have a great thirst for knowledge, and they listen and they laugh at the jokes, and they really enjoy it. And before we do the tour, one of the architects of the Center for Architecture building, Joe Farrell, who Lorrie mentioned. Oh,
yeah, Joe.
Yeah, Joe speaks.
What a nice guy.
Very nice guy. He speaks to the crowd for about 5 or 10 minutes.
He's like 90-something?
Joe, I would say, is around 80 or so, but I have no idea. I know he's older than I am, but I don't think he's 90. But
I think he graduated University of Florida in the mid to late 1950s.
Yeah,
so putting those numbers together, I thought he was probably in his mid-80s.
Right, unless he took, one of those gap years.
Well, he's very youthful for someone who was born roughly around 1935 to 1940, so roughly, something like that. So Joe gives a little talk, and then we lead the people onto the bus, and we onto the trolley, and then we tour around town and talk about things. And what makes it exciting is that there's always some kind of construction going on. So you have your route planned out, and the driver and I know each other very well, and he kind of doesn't even need my instructions anymore. He knows exactly where to go, and if I leave something out, he points at it, And but sometimes we run into like a construction zone and we have to reroute on the fly, and that makes it fun. But we talk about a lot of historical context. And one of my favorite stories is the origin of the word Sarasota, which appears on the old Spanish maps as Zarazote, which I think translates to radiant forest or radiant grove. But I like to say Sarasota is an old Indian word that means place where rich people wait in traffic. So that is usually the first thing I tell to get them warmed up. But and at the time that we're doing these tours in the wintertime, the traffic is quite considerable in Sarasota. So, but it's a fun experience and people enjoy it. And Lorrie does the historic neighborhoods. And of course, as you can tell by listening to her, it's a very thorough and scholarly presentation of the history of these various older neighborhoods in town.
And one thing I can say about Lorrie is she moves around a lot in the trolley. So it's like watching her with one hand on the bar and one on the microphone, and she's sort of swinging around and keeping her balance and talking perfectly, telling the stories. I mean, I got to see this live in my trolley.
It's pretty challenging.
My favorite position is to have my PA's microphone or speaker in the front of the trolley, but I like to stand in about midships, like by the back door. And so by the back door, I'm kind of like in the middle of everybody, and I can face forward, and it's a little bit more of an interactive than standing right in the front. When I stand right in the front, it's a little bit, everything's happening backwards, so it's a little bit.
You're right. So if you're facing forward, you can see what's coming up. If you're standing there looking backwards, and all you see is them.
I have to assume that building is still standing. And in Sarasota, that's always a possibility that it's not, because we tend to tear them down.
So speaking of tear downs, the city of Sarasota owns a giant piece of property that if you Google it, looks mostly like an enormous parking lot with a little tiny building from the sky. It's called the Van Wezel Complex, and it is an incredible piece of real estate right there that the city is trying to figure out what it wants to do with.
Can I just interject and say that the Van Wezel parking lot is the world's most beautifully sited parking lot?
Yes.
Ooh.
In Sarasota Bay.
It is a gorgeous location. So, Lorrie, tell us about how did the Van Wezel come about originally?
Well, so the Van Wezel is our performing arts hall, and it's
Modernist building.
Yes, it was done by Taliesin Associates Architecture. You're familiar with that name from
Frank Lloyd Wright.
And it was completed in, Harold knows this date better than I do as well, early 1960s, right?
Late 1969.
Okay, sorry.
The performance, January 1970.
Yeah. So it's come under, there's been a lot of attention directed to it recently. City of Sarasota is coming towards the end of a process that's been going on, depending on how you view it, for several years or for 1 year, to reimagine the downtown Bayfront. And right in the center of that downtown Bayfront is our Van Wezel Performing Arts Hall, beloved by some, and as we have found over the last months, there are also some people that don't care for it very much at all. So there's been quite a lot of community discussion about whether it should be preserved, if so, what kind of uses should remain there, whether we need another performing arts hall, which is larger. And there's been some very, very good conversation that's come up around that, where people are talking about historic preservation and structures that have cultural in addition to architectural significance, as the Van Wezel does. There are people with decades of memories about going there and having very special experiences.
Now, the site, when you first see it, there's the Van Wezel, and then there's this enormous parking lot. Was this originally planned to be something else besides just this hall?
Not to my knowledge. I wouldn't be surprised if the parking lot has grown over time to accommodate our changing lifestyle and how people get to the Van Wezel and how they probably come on their own. But the parking lot was not planned for other uses. There are some adjoining uses. We have the orchestra, a municipal auditorium, formerly Chamber of Commerce building, and so parking is shared to some extent, but to the best of my knowledge, that was planned originally just to serve the Van Wezel.
And I assume now, Harold, that these various ideas and master plans being put forth are going to have multiple buildings on that site.
Yes, exactly. And if I could just say something about the parking lot. The land that the parking lot is on and the Van Wezel also sits on was dredged from Bay Bottom. So it wasn't a case where they had to sacrifice existing real estate, existing land to put up a parking lot. They invented that land. And so I think that changed the real estate dynamic of the decision-making back in the 60s. They didn't have to worry about, we've got this plot of land here. Should we put a parking lot there? They didn't have to do that. They made it was kind of like the Hong Kong airport that was built on dredge and fill by Norman Foster, I think, if I'm correct.
Sure.
Instead of using land that they didn't have, they just dredged and filled it out of the bottom of the ocean. And that's what happened here. So I think if they had to actually sacrifice high, dry land, that it might have changed the equation, but they didn't have to do it that way. But now people are thinking, well, we have this parking lot on this beautiful waterfront site. Why would we do that? And, there's a reason for it. And it was easy to do back when it was done. That was just before dredging and filling was outlawed in Florida. For a long time in Florida, they were the expression "by waterfront." They're not making it anymore. Was not true. We're making a lot of it.
All that stuff you can't do anymore. You can't make lakes in your backyard. You can't dredge and fill. I mean, what have we come to?
Well, I mean, if you look at maps of Florida's metropolitan areas, look at Miami and look at the shoreline of Biscayne Bay, you'll see a lot of perfectly round or oval-shaped islands. These were man-made, and you can't do that anymore. Now, lakes you can make. If you're doing a subdivision out east someplace, you have to control your floodwater, so you can build retention ponds so that you don't have flooding. But the parking lot, still people look at it and think it could be so much more than a parking lot. Also, when it was built, parking garages weren't really that much in vogue in a small Florida town either. So now the idea is you could put up some parking garages, one or two of those, and turn the existing parking lot area into a space for public parks, outdoor amphitheaters, walking paths, and then put up a new performing arts hall. And so the big question becomes what to do with the Van Wezel Hall. Do you tear it down, or do you try to repurpose it? And because we're pretty much consigned to the fact that if this plan is going to go forward, the centerpiece of it will be a new performing arts hall that will be very expensive and will seat 500 to 700 more people than the Van Wezel seats right now. So
how big is it now?
1,750 seats, roughly,
and
no
mid-range.
center aisle, and that is a source of complaint by some people. It has continental seating, which allows it to be evacuated very quickly in the event of an emergency. But people do
continental seating. That sounds fancy.
Continental seating. Basically, you enter from the side, so every 3 rows has its own door.
Oh, okay. Like how they load people at Disney.
Almost, yeah. So you enter from the side, and if you're going to climb stairs to get to your seat that's higher up on the row, higher up on the auditorium, you ascend on an exterior staircase and then go turn right into the doorway and go to your seat. So
I've seen that at the Palm Springs Museum of Art. They have something like that as well.
But there's no center aisle, and people complain about that. So. And the hall also at one time was known as having exceptional acoustics. And around almost 20 years ago, the back of the house was enlarged to accommodate larger shows, Broadway shows, musicals. And it's thought that may have affected the acoustics because now the Sarasota Orchestra is among the groups that complain about the acoustics of the building, which is ironic. Us old-timers find it ironic because or I should say we old-timers, because it was heralded for its acoustics when it was new. So there is that school of reuse and refurbish, and there's another school of tear it down.
Lorrie, there's a big conference coming up this fall celebrating the 100th birthday of Paul Rudolph. Tell us about that.
Oh, well, that is going to be our Sarasota Mod weekend in November, sponsored by the Sarasota Architectural Foundation. One of the earlier conferences featured Rudolph, but because this is such a big celebration of his birthday, he will be featured again, and there'll be speakers coming in from out of town, tours, walking tours, bus tours. Plans are being slowly unveiled by the Architectural Foundation, but I know that they are promoting it, and they're going to have some great things going on for us that weekend.
And what weekend is that going to be?
Sarasota Mod Weekend is going to be November 9th through 11th, 2018.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I really want to thank you both for being on the show, joining us from your vacation, Harold. This has been great to learn about Sarasota and all the exciting things that you can do visiting down there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. Great to be on your show.
Yes, very much. Thank you, George.
Thanks for listening. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special agent for Modernist Houses, 919-995-0550. Okay, take us out, Tom.
Visit usmodernist.org to listen to past shows and discover our massive mid-century modernist archives. US Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Cindy Stratton, not a real name.
Not a real name.
Researches guests from a secret location inside
Very secret.
Starbucks, which doesn't exactly narrow it down because there's about a zillion of those.
That's why it's so secret.
US Modernist Radio is a production of Triangle Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational organization for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. George and I will be back in 2 weeks with another dredge from the bottom of the bay edition of US Modernist Radio.
All right, sir.